This is iBookBinding podcast. I'm Stepan. My co-host is Pavel. And Today our guest is a hobbyist printer from California, Ivan Gulkov. And hi, Ivan. Nice to see you almost in real life. At least
Almost.
not through texts and messages. And we will talk about hobby printing, or printing as a hobby, because I guess there may be some differences if you compare to printing as a business. And then Ivan will show us his workshop, and that should be fun.
I'd love to. Yeah.
Tell us a bit about yourself. What's your education? What are you doing? And how and when you decided to try printing old-fashioned way?
Well, basically, first I fell in love with computers. Old computers like ZX Spectrum, basic program, all of that, which led me to fall in love with graphic design, because I love drawing things on computers. Now, having gotten to that stage, having fallen in love with graphic design led me to fall in love with letterpress, which is a logical continuation, because all of the rules that define graphic design, basically, all of the standards, all of the aesthetics derive from letterpress. And before that, illuminated manuscripts, but we'll get into that. So I'm essentially moving backwards in time.
The roots are definitely there, but it feels like a huge step from graphic design and using digital tools to letterpress.
Right, but when you do graphic design, you learn about traditional methods of how the design works. And when you do typography in particular, when you look, say, at a program like Quark Express or InDesign or Publisher, basically all of the terminology, all of the rules, all of the sets, all of the aesthetics that follow are direct descendants of letterpress. Like you have leading, you have kerning, you have justification. It's justified to the right, it's justified to the left. Why is it in boxes? And every single one of those things actually relates to handset typography. It's basically the same genre, and I like to pursue things to their roots. So as I gotten into typesetting, as I gotten into book design, it felt like a natural progression but regression, I guess. It felt like a natural regression to go back to letterpress.
Yeah.
And then I visited some studios way back in college when I was still a student. I visited some print shops, traditional print shops, and it immediately clicked. Okay, this is where the song belongs. This is where all those strange terms and vague rules come from. And I gotta investigate that.
But what was the next step? When we were discussing you, we both commented on how strange and unfamiliar term hobbyist printer sounds, because to become a hobbyist bookbinder, all you need is a piece of leather and a needle. But to become a hobbyist printer, you need quite a bit of toolkit. So,
oh yes,
yeah,
very heavy. which is why moving to any place is always oh my god, nearly impossible. There are tons of equipment, and lead type weighs a lot, and I mean not just the press itself. My press is fairly small, but the type, the actual lead type. Tell me about it. Basically, the term hobby printing came about around the end of 19th century when people like William Morris established his Chelmsford Press. Another route was amateur journalism that emerged in America around the time after the Civil War. And the two sort of combined, and it was basically a way for tradesmen, for printers who were actual professional printers, when they retired, they usually established their own print shops in their garages, which wouldn't hold the big presses, so they would have small presses, and they didn't have jobs to speak of, so they would print to their heart's delight. They would print what they always wanted to print before they retired. And that was how the tradition of hobby presses began.
I don't know much about history of these processes of history of modern history of letterpress or something. But was there any relation to, I don't know, printers presses becoming more widespread and cheaper, or how did it go?
Basically, it was the major factor was the introduction of small tabletop presses, which happened around 1870, 1880, 1890 here in America. Companies like Kelsey and Baltimore produced these. Oh, sure. It's easier. Produced these tiny tabletops, small variants of what's known as a platen press. So you have big presses, known as jobbing presses, usually with a throttle that you pump, and the wheel that spins and it goes round and round. But around 1875, William Kelsey came up with the idea of a small press. Now, his first press, of course, was a scam, and he just basically charged money for something he didn't have.
Or was it a Kickstarter project of the time?
Exactly. He basically collected money and produced nothing. But he was young at the time, and the police came and spoke to him and told him not to do this again. So he did it again. But this time he actually delivered, and he created the small press. And then other companies followed, and there was this explosion of small presses that individuals could own. And it became a hobby. It became a hobby, and it gave rise to, like, say, apothecaries, pharmacists printing their own labels, and bookbinders printing their own little bookbinding cards to put inside inside the binding. You've probably seen a few under the end.
Yeah. I have a couple of things like this one.
Oh,
I think
nice.
I guess this press was used for printing labels, like you told.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like that. It's unique.
Yeah. And it also has a tray for a type.
Can you send me a picture later on?
Yeah, sure.
It's phenomenal.
And
I thought I knew all of the small forms that hobby presses took shape.
And then I got this
one.
Here it is.
Have you ever used either of them?
No. But for the last two, at least I've seen pictures. But the first one, that's unique. That's never came across anything like that.
Judging from how you talk about it, hobby printing is a big thing. Like, there are many people like you. Is there some kind of society of hobby printers?
Yes. Well, it used to be much bigger, of course. The numbers dwindled from like beginning of 20th century until now, from tens of thousands to hundreds. Nowadays, at least in the States, there are probably about 150 hobby printers. So it's rather small community. It's basically an offshoot of Fine Press, except we don't look to make any money of it. So we don't have to hold ourselves to such high standards, or can afford to invest in fine materials that the Fine Press uses.
Well, that's a pity, because at least my feeling is that of course the situation is pretty similar with bookbinders. I mean, there are fewer and fewer bookbinders with every decade, but I think there are more than 150 bookbinders. I mean, hobbyist bookbinders in the United States. And I don't mean now. I don't talk about I don't know, scrapbooking or something like that, because of course there are a lot of people who do scrapbooking, and it's absolutely different genre. But I mean people who at least try to do fine binding or something like that, or experiment with styles. And
but then I only mentioned hobby printers, but because there of course still exist quite a large number of professional letterpress printers.
Well, yeah.
And basically the conventions we go to are all of the same, so you can't really tell one from the other. And usually one doubles on the side. So most traditional letterpress printers who are in it as a trade, who are in it as a profession, do hobby printing on the side. Likewise, most hobby printers take on jobs. It's basically, the distinction is between making your living from this and doing this mostly out of your own expense.
Say one would want to start as a hobby printer. What would a starter kit like yours cost? Would it be necessarily antique, or are there companies still producing these smaller kind of presses?
Not as far as I know. They're all pretty much antiques by now. There was a company in China that did some replicas like a year ago, but I'm not sure how well they're doing, and their presses were way too expensive for anyone to buy, because you can get the actual authentic antique one for a quarter of the price. Because the thing in the printing world, basically, prices are not very high. Equipment, at least in the States, it's different in Europe and very different in Russia. But in the States, equipment is somewhat widely available.
What kind of prices are we talking about?
Right. Well, back when I started, which was about 12 or 15 years ago, I don't even remember, probably 15. Yeah, I think I was 15. Back when I started, I got my printing press, a few trays of type, a few cases of type, some furniture, which is things you use to lock up the type in the chase so it doesn't fall out, and some ink, although very old ink from the 70s. Still works, still good ink. All for the price of $250.
250.
350.
Well, that's very affordable.
But of course, it was in disrepair. It was rusted. All type was basically all thrown into a bucket with mouse droppings and cockroaches and things. But still, $350. A few weekends of sorting type, cleaning the press, elbow grease, and light sanding. And the pillow face press was born easily. Nowadays, of course, the prices will be much different. Nowadays, you can probably have the same setup if you search for it, and if you try to do it on the cheap, for about 2,000.
2,000. Okay.
Because of the resurgence, because of the renaissance of letterpress that's happened since the early 2000s.
And the bulk of it would be the price of the press, or is the type more expensive? Surely you need lots and lots of it to do.
Yes, well, the bulk of it would be the press. I mean, I've only gotten a few fonts, small fonts, and then you invest in other fonts. I mean, luckily for all of us, there are still functioning type foundries. And that's the other aspect of hobby printing, is there are hobby and professional type foundries still around who cast shiny new type out of the traditional type metal, lead, tin, and antimony.
That's one of the areas we need to cover in one of our future podcasts, invite somebody from a type foundry.
Oh, yes. You definitely got to talk to, what's his name? Sky Shipley of Skyline Type Foundry. He loves to give interviews, and his foundry shop is the prettiest to look at because he's such a neat jerk.
Okay.
Actually, I have my own little tiny type foundry, which I'm basically, I made what's known in history as a hand mold.
Yeah.
The thing that Gutenberg probably, we don't know for certain, but probably used to cast his type, which was the big invention, because there were printing presses before Gutenberg. He did not invent printing. But what he did invent, and he didn't invent movable type because Chinese did before them, but he did invent type mold, probably. We don't know, most likely. A little handheld device that allows you to cast new type ad infinitum. And because I wanted to print something in Church Slavonic, in Russian, in like Vyaz and Ustav and Polustav, and couldn't find any of those fonts. They just don't exist nowadays. I basically made my own. I made my own hand mold, somewhat in the image of the one Gutenberg used. I've built a CNC machine, a CNC mill, to make the punches, to make the matrices. Because traditionally, you would have to carve a punch, and so there's a special profession called a punch cutter who cuts the punch in steel, tempers it, then strikes it against a little piece of brass. That's called striking a matrix, and thus you get the matrix with the outline of the type, and then you put it in a hand mold. But I couldn't do any of that because I'm lazy and shoot for fingers.
And also, it takes forever. Didn't it take like 4 years, Gutenberg, to make his first font just enough to print his first Bible?
It wasn't just making a font. Well, the making a font shouldn't take 4 years. I mean, you can make a font in probably half a year. But he had to create the whole process. He had to create the line of work. So he had to create the perfect ink solution first. The ink that would spread evenly with those ink balls. The press that would be able to take the pressure. The type, first to draw the type and to create all of the letter shapes, because Gutenberg's type there were, if I recall, there were about 100 ligatures in it, because he wanted to approximate handwritten manuscripts as much as possible, which called for a lot of scribal abbreviations, a lot of ligatures of letters sticking together, a lot of alternative letters, because he wanted his lines in the Bible to be perfect, without any gaps, without any of the crap we see in later Bibles or in later publications, and even now. You know, you have big gaps between letters, letter spacing, kerning problems. He avoided all of that by creating a shitload of matrices, supposedly, because we don't know. Actually, no. When everyone talks about how Gutenberg did it, we all assume, because no documents actually survive. The first printing press we have records of, at least pictures of, is 50 years after Gutenberg. But we assume because the technology has not changed from Gutenberg all the way to like mid 19th century. It was more or less the same for 500 years. We assume that that was the process that Gutenberg used, and that was the process he envisioned. But I think most of that time spent, most of those years, was experimentation, getting things to align with things and creating the workflow, which of course probably was the thing that got him bankrupt.
I also know that Dutch contest the invention, and they think that there was a press before Gutenberg in the Netherlands.
Well, they contest, but the lady does protest some too much.
I know that contemporaries or near contemporaries of Gutenberg wrote about him as the founding figure of their business. So most of what we know about him is either from the court documents when he went bankrupt, or from colleagues from other German towns that wrote about him as the man who originated the whole process. And also speaking of how he managed to be so close to the look of handwritten manuscripts. There is a famous copy of Gutenberg's Bible printed on vellum, still in Oxford, that was catalogued as a manuscript until 1890s. It was so close because it was on vellum, because it was hand-colored, but mostly because the letters were so varied and everything was exactly as it should. He even drew the lines, the red lines that scribes used. So that did the trick. Shame he went bankrupt. He should have been famous and wealthy. Didn't happen.
Well, so few printers are. There's an old joke that the best way to make a small fortune in printing is to start with a big one.
Well,
so you're not,
which I think is true for most of the books.
So you're not planning going professional anytime soon?
I don't think it pays enough, to be honest. And I like the idea of hobby printing in the sense that it does not restrict you to the customer's demands. So you can print on your own, at your own time, at your own leisure, and at the quality and at the quantity that you desire yourself, which is basically the whole idea of hobby press.
Well, who is your audience then? Who do you aim it at?
Mostly other printers, fellow printers, because there are mailing lists and forums and exchange groups who collect other printer stuff, and the general population, whoever damn pleases to look at my stuff. I'm always open. I mean, I do an occasional commercial job as well. I mean, sometimes people want custom printed book plates or little certificates and things, or business cards with the purpose effect.
I once received a wedding invitation that was printed.
Oh, I've printed a wedding invitation, although never again. I'm done talking to brides.
It's
much
never
drama.
good enough.
It's a path to insanity. Working with brides is never again. Although it did pay well in the end.
Okay.
But I think I lost more on hospital bills.
But I assume nowadays you can order any kind of font and they'll make it for you.
No. Sadly, no. The process of creating new fonts. So no one basically nowadays, no one casts new fonts because it's too involved of a process, and the know-how is basically lost. There are still a few, 1 or 2 people in the world who know how to do this, how to cast new fonts from new designs. But they are without means and couldn't be bothered. They're in their 90s. You can cast fonts from old matrices, that were milled like a century before.
But I think with the modern fonts, there is another problem because they are all copyrighted. Century-old fonts are not copyrighted because their creators are long dead. But all new, not all, there are free fonts or fonts that are distributed on based on different licenses that allow copying and stuff. But many of the modern fonts are copyrighted.
Well, to be honest, most of the fonts were copyrighted even back in the day. It's just people didn't care. So there were always lawsuits between type foundries. Everyone stole from everyone. It's the same with old little printing presses. There are a dozen of printing presses that look exactly the same from different companies, and everyone was always suing everyone else, and they were always tangled in lawsuit dispute all the time. And same with the fonts, they would just recast it, make it a little bolder, and change the name, or change the name entirely without doing anything else. So I think that that in that regard, the situation hasn't changed much. I mean, there's still font piracy today, right? It's major.
If I get you right, you can't even print in such design classics like Eric Gill's fonts, because they were invented in the 20th century. So 20th century fonts are out of question for you.
What? No. 21st fonts are not out of question for me. I mean, I love new fonts. I'm not a retro geek.
But how do? I don't get it. But you just said that you can't make new fonts.
No, I said the type foundries, the people who cast new fonts. Yes, they don't have the know-how nowadays, or the time, or the money to cast new designs because of the time and effort involved in creating new matrices. In general, I mean, there are still people making new fonts from their original designs, and that's something I'm aspiring to do. I'm trying to create something resembling Francysk Skaryna's typeface from Skaryna's Bible. So far, I've only gotten just a single letter B. But as far as being commercially viable, there's just too much of an investment and not enough of a return, because metal type costs about as much as digital type nowadays. That's the thing that blows my mind. But to buy a piece of metal type, like I showed you, would cost you about the same as to buy a digital font. About $35.
Could you talk a bit more about this Skaryna project of yours? You should probably tell to our listeners, our viewers, who Frank Skaryna was, because not many know.
Right. So the Francysk Skaryna was a scholar and a printer from what is now Belarus. At the time, the Great Duchy of Lithuania, I would guess, Commonwealth of Polish Lithuania, who basically was the first Slavic printer, the first printer who happened to be a Slav who printed in Cyrillics.
But he didn't do it in Slavic lands, right? Wasn't it in Venice?
Yes.
No?
He designed the most beautiful Slavic alphabet, which he printed all of his Bibles in.
But where did he print them? I thought he did it in Italy, or at least
Venice.
I think it was in Venice. Yeah.
Are you sure? Because I thought he came back. After studying at the university, I thought he came back to what's now Belarus and established his print shop. But I'm not quite sure. So
we'll fact check it.
I only know he was a Slav and he printed in Cyrillics.
And I've seen his books, and the thing about them, in design terms, they are so much better than first Russian books that were printed much later. His fonts are better. His overall design is much better. Yeah.
Fonts are better. His overall designs are better. Much later, I wouldn't say. 50 years difference.
So you are inspired by Skaryna's Bible to do what exactly? What are your aspirations?
To produce a font of type that I can use to set a few pages of Bible with, maybe, or like the wedding invitations. If such a bride ever emerges, who would happen to appreciate something as crazy as that.
Yeah, I guess this gives a scope and a scale for the projects, because you spend half a year or a year to create a font, to cast it, and then you print several pages, and well.
Yes. Well, that's the essence of hobby press. You asked me what hobby press is. This is hobby press. You spend time and money to produce something of little to no monetary value. That's the difference between a hobby press and a fine press, because a fine press, while doing the same, at least expects to get the money back eventually.
I guess we have to hope that our civilization will get richer and wealthier with every year or century or something, and there will be just enough wealth accumulated so that people will be able to have printing as their hobbies and to continue this process.
Well, it doesn't cost a lot. It's mostly time. It's the thing with printing. It doesn't actually it's not a very expensive hobby. It's a time-consuming hobby. And frankly, printing takes about like 10% of it. 50% is taken by registration and make ready and typesetting. Another 20% is taken by disassembly and putting things back into the boxes. The rest is clean up. Because when you print, it's a messy business. It's no wonder why printing was called the black art, because everything is covered in ink at the end of the day. It's everywhere, and it's nearly impossible to wash off. I mean, you get it on your skin, it stays on your skin for like a month.
Oh, I really like those old books that were proof copies, the copies of the books sent to the printers. You can always find fingerprints on them, and they're not fingerprints of the author, as it's often said.
Yes.
They're always fingerprints of the printers, because the stuff gets everywhere.
Well, there's a reason why a printer's apprentice was known as a printer's devil, because he was covered in ink from top to bottom, because he was the one doing all of the cleanup. So they look like little devils. They look like маленькие черти, all covered in soot. It's messy business.
Yeah.
And what kind of people are drawn towards this hobby? How would you describe the community? Who are they? Mostly men, for example?
It's basically two sides. There's the old tradesmen, the old people who studied the pressmen, typesetters, correctors, publishers, who retire and get a little press into their basement and just continue on printing on one side. On the other side, it's young whippersnapper graphic designers who basically fall in love with the process and try to follow suit. And also some printmakers, craftspeople, but mostly it's those two. So old tradesmen and on one side, and
nerds on the other.
Designers on the other.
And it sounds like a very nerdy business. I like it a lot.
It's fun. Also, the drinking parties are amazing. I mean, there's a tradition among printers stemming from around like 17th century called the waste goose. No one quite knows what the etymology of the word is. Probably something to do with geese, but no one knows. Traditionally, it was held on St. Bartholomew's Day, and it was basically a way for the owners of print shops, for master printers, to throw a party to their fellow congregation, to their fellow men. At which point they would all get ridiculously drunk, fall off their chairs, and start bellowing out stupid songs about printing. Now, the tradition kept on and still lives on, and there are waste geese happening in United States, England, I think the Netherlands, although I'm not sure, Germany, I think, as well. They're amazing. The parties are amazing, basically. I'm in there for the parties. Forget the printing. Because you walk around, you look at old presses, you look at each other's type collections, you trade things and sell things and buy things, and then get ridiculously drunk and into deep and meaningful conversations that only two drunk printers can. That's another thing. Traditionally, printing and drinking always went hand in hand. Printers always had the reputation of being horrible drunkards. Even from the time of Gutenberg, basically, when you read something like Moxon's Mechanical Exercises, all people are concerned with is gathering money to buy beer, from Benjamin Franklin's, another printer, description of in his autobiography when he went to London to a print shop. No, he didn't drink himself. He was a teetotaler at the time. But everyone, basically, they drank in the morning instead of for breakfast. They would drink 2 times in the afternoon for lunch and like
brunch.
for lunch. I forgot the name. They would drink in the evening, and then the master printers knew a trick, because they would save the very little last bit of their drink before going off home. It was known as a thimbleful for the comp. A rookie printer would just drink his fill and would be struggling to finish his job, so he would stay late. Now, a master printer knew he had to save just a tiny bit at the end of at the bottom of his tankard, because when it was time to go home, he would pour that beer onto the form, onto the letterpress form with all of the letters, making them stick. So he wouldn't have to do such a good job in locking it down, so he can go home earlier.
How does one start, apart from being from buying an antique press and fonts? Do you have to learn those skills? How did you start? Did you learn from somebody? Do you yourself teach, or is it entirely self-taught, the whole process?
Well, there's a traditional way and my way. My way, I basically learned from books, essentially. So I did not have a master. I didn't study under anyone. I basically just read everything I could, all of the books, all of the forum posts, and visited some print shops, but indiscriminately. Traditionally, the trade it was one of those old medieval trades that were taught from master to apprentice, and it was supposed to take about 7 years. So you become first a student, which means sleeping under the table and basically washing the floor for like the first 3 years, probably. Then you become an apprentice, at which point you're actually taught some valuable skills. After that, you progress to Journeyman, which means basically taking up your shit and going places and traveling from town to town, from place to place, learning the trade, eventually settling down and starting your own print shop, at which point you can be considered a master printer and you can take on an apprentice or a student of your own. Now, that surprisingly, that system in the States has survived until like 1960s. There was still traveling pressmen. There was still traveling printers known as tramp printers, all the way to 1970s, which gave a whole genre of literature and folklore, because they would sing songs about tramping printers and tell stories, because they were considered the finest. The best printer you can have is a tramp printer. Now, he smells bad because he's basically a bum. He walks and talks funny because he's always drunk, because that sort of went with the trade. But he was the finest in terms of skill, because he could work on any equipment anywhere and could do any job. He could compose pages, he could typeset, he could lock it up, he could print, he could sweep the floor afterwards, he could correct, he could work as an editor, he could do anything. All you need to do is give him a little shot, a few shots, and a place to stay. And they told the most amazing stories, which is why all of the other pressmen who were staying locally would always fight for the chance to get that stinky person to stay with them for the night. It was an interesting trade.
I understand that the system of journeymen, craftsmen, and artisans is still existed in modern Germany as well.
Well, I think it does for carpenters.
Well, it still survived for bookbinders as well.
Oh, interesting.
As far as I know, and I'm not sure about printers because it's a bit further away from me. But still, I know that it still exists for bookbinders in some form.
I know that German carpenters still have to wander the earth for like a year and a day.
Yeah.
They have special clothing, special hats, a little staff, wood that they walk through. I actually met one of those guys traveling from Germany in that garb.
I know they're still making what's called masterwork, like masterpiece. To become a master, you still need to complete that one special piece. The same about people who make furniture. They usually make miniature pieces of furniture, and only if you can make an ideal, a perfect miniature, I don't know, a table or a wardrobe, only then you become a master.
Yeah, I don't think it was the same way with printers. At least it was the same way with printers in Germany, but not in England or United States. Basically, there's nothing like there aren't any master printers. You can call yourself one if you have a print shop, but no one actually in their right mind would. No one actually calls themselves master printer because there's no process of getting to master them. It's something that other people can call you, but you cannot call yourself. And by this time nowadays, there are no master printers left. I think someone like Eric Gill was probably one of the last ones.
So it's November now when we're recording this video, and I guess it will be posted still in November. And this is the month when we have we usually have this Boekkunstbeurs book arts fair here in Leiden in the Netherlands. And this year, due to coronavirus lockdown, it was cancelled, obviously. But that's an event that that is created jointly by the Dutch Guild of Printers and Dutch Guild of Bookbinders.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever been here in Leiden, or maybe to other European printing fairs or something? What's your experience of that? Maybe not only European, maybe in some other regions as well.
Well, I've only been to St. Bride's in London. It used to be an old trade school for printers that now became a library and a museum that's basically closed off to the public, that you have to ask permission to enter. And it was quite fascinating. I'm trying to remember. The quite an amazing selection of old books and old prints, some original designs from Eric Gill, for example, for his letterform, how he actually constructed them. Other than that, no, I haven't had the pleasure. I've visited a lot of printing festivals here in the United States, the Whiskies, which I mentioned earlier, and a lot of printing museums here. But I visited one printing museum in St. Petersburg.
In Florida or in Russia?
In Russia, in the proper St. Petersburg, in a real.
Yeah, I understand that St. Bride's have a special place for bookbinders as well, because at least designer bookbinders competition shows their the bindings selected for the competition at St. Bride's for some time. Every time there is a competition, and probably some other. I'm not sure about. I don't remember about the Society of Bookbinders competition, which is also held in United Kingdom, but I need to check. But so yeah, that's a familiar name, familiar place.
What about printers in Russia? I know there has been a certain resurgence of interest. There, I know a couple of guys who started their own print shop here. You could call them professionals because they make their money from it, but they're basically amateurs. And I know of a few more shops, both in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Have you had any contact with them? What's your knowledge of it?
I think I know most of them, and good friends, like the Demon Press with Evgeny Perfilyev and Sergei Besov and the Suvorov. Another one. They're amazing and wonderful, and we basically corresponded back when they didn't have print shops. In some small ways, I inspired them to start on this path, but then they sort of outgrew me a lot by actually establishing very successful businesses and producing amazing work. I would probably also mention Fyodor Shulgov from Kiev. What's the name of his press? It escapes me from right now. Oficina Dolmani, I think.
But it is still a small community, not like 100 people in US.
Well, it's a small community. I mean, where is it a big community? It's there are few printers in the world left, because it's not, like I said, it's not a very profitable business. If you want to make millions, it's not the way to go. I mean, printing in general is dwindling down, not just letterpress printing. And letterpress printing takes, you have to have a lot of equipment, you have to spend a lot of time. It's slow print. One of the old-time printers called it slow print. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, and most of the population would not be able to appreciate the effort.
No.
So you're basically left, as far as customers, you're left with people who value this sort of thing and understand its value, which is basically other fellow designers.
That's what I wanted to say, but that's not that small a market, at least in Moscow. There's a great appreciation among designers for handmade prints. There is a series of markets where you can buy handmade prints from young designers in very different techniques. So you can even make your living off it. I know a couple of designers who make a considerable part of their income from their prints. So there is great interest for it in Moscow.
I guess it helps that the market in Moscow and in Russia in general is underdeveloped. So there is fewer people to compete for the buyers. In the United States, I guess the market is absolutely different because there are more printers and it's sort of split between them, and it's much harder to.
It's still fairly small.
Yeah,
it's still mostly just people who are in the book arts or or at least know someone in the book arts who could appreciate this thing. I used to do printmaking, like intaglio and things. And one of my instructors, he always said that the only people who understand and appreciate and buy prints from printmakers are fellow printmakers. No one else understands what it takes to do dry point or mezzotint or an aquatint intaglio. They just look at it. Oh, is that pencil or?
But don't you feel like there is an ever-growing interest, perhaps as a protest to the modern world, to have something made by hand and to know how it's made? Speaking of William Morris, I mean, that's how it started. It started as a protest to depersonalized industrial process, and even more so now when most people don't ever hold in their hand anything made by not by a faceless machine or by what amounts to a slave somewhere in southeastern China. So it is much, much nicer, if you can afford it, of course, to have something made by an artist, a craftsman, a master. And I think there is a great future in all these crafts.
Well, there was certainly a very big resurgence, basically starting with the internet in like late 90s. Because before then, basically the entire trade was dying. The entire trade at the end, in 97, consisted of very old people in their garages who were still working to please other very old people in their garages, who still remember the old days and resented photocomposition machines and even linotypes to some extent. But then it bloomed with the introduction of the internet and news groups and forums and things. And as we march on into more and more automated industrialized world, there is, yes, a big resurgence of traditional crafts. Is it enough to build a viable business on? Probably. I mean, some people, like, again, the Demon Press managed to. Although probably the only group, the only print shop that I know of that manages to work commercially, but do so in handset type, that is not actually a fine press at the same time, is the amazing girls from the Starship Press. Now, if you want to find someone to call a master printer, it's those girls, and they're amazing. They basically resurrected the idea of that was known at the beginning of 20th century as artistic printing, which kind of stems from William Morris again, but it was a way for printers to establish themselves against traditional letterpress printers, to establish themselves against the people who did lithography. So they were looking at all of those beautiful swirls and all of those beautiful designs, like gaslight designs, and said, well, we can do this all in type metal. We can just bend the rules. We can assemble type in very creative ways. We can combine things, combinational borders and things and ornaments that would be just as good, if not better. And it is better to me, but to them it was. But most successful commercial print shops today who do letterpress do it with photopolymer, because that I mean, whenever I take an actual commercial job, I do it on photopolymer because it just makes more sense, because you have hundreds of fonts and you can design anything, and it doesn't cost a whole lot of time, effort, or money, to be honest. As far as handset typography, as far as traditional typography, I don't think there's much of a market for that, except for those girls. No, they manage it beautifully. Arian Press is another example here in San Francisco, but they're a fine press. They do very super expensive, very luxurious editions of classical books like Moby Dick, the Bible. It's all done on a monocaster, so it's typography. It's not handset, it's machine set, but it is letterpress. And they employ very famous artists who design them, illustrations and things, and they sell a few copies to very wealthy collectors. But that's and they bind them beautifully in leather and things. But that's a slightly different story.
I guess we'll have to.
As far as small scale trade printing, if you want to make money, you have to do it with photopolymer.
Yeah, you need to work with collectors and make really expensive bindings out of your printed pages. I guess we will have to ask you to give us some links so that we will be able to post them below the video. Links to
some works. I'll send you some links, some videos.
Yeah,
there are quite a few.
You mentioned that most of the customers of printers are other printers, and I remember that the only full-size prints I have it's by the way, it's a good way to introduce our next week's guest, Louisa Blackbird. She's a Danish-Scottish printer, designer and printer, and the only print I have is a print she made, and I saw it last year during this book arts fair in Leiden when I was taking part, and then she was as well, and we stood like in not next to each other, but in neighboring rows of the fair, and here is this print.
In God we trust.
And I just like the humor and satire of this print and some of other her prints, but then the prices are not low. I understand why the prices are not low, because it's a lot of work and effort and time and investment. But then for many people, paying at least dozens or maybe hundreds of euros or dollars for a single print may be too extravagant, I guess. So
I've never actually seen actual letterpress printers selling anything for that amount, unless you mean complete books. But as far as individual prints, they're usually pretty cheap.
Yeah.
You can get a print for like $10, no problem.
Okay.
So it's I mean, it depends on how many colors are used, because each additional color means the whole process of setting new type, printing, registering, printing, then washing up.
Yeah,
which sort of complicates things. And the more colors you have, the more misregister you get between them, and the more effort you have to take into your make ready and into your preparation. But I've never actually seen. I mean, I've seen fine prints like from printmakers who do like Intaglio and things. They can cost a lot, but prints from actual traditional printers, I've never seen them being expensive, to be honest. Sadly, I wish they were. I could sell them for a lot.
Okay.
Like, for example, let me show you.
That's it for today. Thanks a lot, Ivan, for talking to us, and for showing your craft. Wish you a lot of luck with your future projects and with this idea of creating Skaryna's font. I think it's an amazing idea. And many thanks to all of our viewers and to our supporters on Patreon. It's because of the pledges of the supporters we have money to pay for editing of these podcast videos, and that means a lot to us. Thanks a lot. Our next guest, as I told a bit earlier, is Louisa Blackbird, printer, Danish Scottish printer. We will talk to her next week, and subscribe to our channel, and
Bye.
see you next time. Bye.
See you guys.